tuning in. The question we're going to look at on today's show is, why does God allow suffering for children? And if you tuned into last week's show with Peter Genovese, who was excellent in the discussion, and please do watch it on YouTube if you missed that show, he basically hit me with a left hook with this question and said, how could I as a Christian account for the suffering of children at the hands, for example, of paedophile priests, etc.? How could God allow such a thing? And the second reason I wanted to really look at this question today is that here in the UK, we've been shocked to hear a news report of a poor 4-year-old boy called Daniel Palka. Desperately sad story of a boy who was abused and killed by his ruthless mother and her violent partner. The consultant pediatrician described his body as only weighing 1.5 stone on his death, and his skin was hanging off in folds. She said he looked like a victim of one of the concentration camps. A desperately sad story. How could God allow such cruelty to happen? And you may remember I said last week that I was somewhat agnostic about this question. It is a difficult question, but I do believe it deserved a better response than I gave last week. And so in this show, I want to try and give a bit more of a reflective consideration of that question. Now, of course, people have thought about this for many years, and about 200 years ago, the novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky raises this question in his novel, The Brothers Karamazov. And he raises it through the character of someone who represents atheism called Ivan. And Ivan is in discussion with his brother, who's a novice monk called Alyosha. And he refers to some stories that were apparently in the Russian newspapers of his day. And he talks about 3 stories which were in the news. The first one was a cruel mother who locked her daughter in a toilet for wetting her bed at night. And she's covered in her own excrement. And she's locked all night in this toilet, and she's banging on the door saying, crying out to this dear, kind God trapped in this toilet. A second example of extreme child suffering that he mentions was a young boy who threw a stone at the hound of a local lord. He was caught. The lord caught him, and as punishment, the boy was stripped, and he was set off running across a field, and the rest of the hounds are released on him. This pack of hounds are released on this boy, who catch him and rip his flesh apart in the presence of his parents, who are watching all of this. Then the third story that Dostoevsky mentions in his book, this could be propaganda by the Russians against the Turks, but he claimed that the Turkish soldiers used to wave gun barrels in the front of Russian babies, and the babies would pull on the sort of grab the gun and pull on the trigger, and these poor little innocent children had their brains blown out by these soldiers. And Ivan says, if you were the architect of the universe, how could you construct such a universe, even if it depended on only one tiny innocent creature being tortured to death in this way? And his brother can't answer the question. He says, I wouldn't do that. And of course, if Dostoevsky had written his novel today, he could have drawn on even more extreme examples of children tossed into the gas chambers, or paedophiles making snuff videos of them. So what can we say in response to this terrible suffering. I want to begin by looking at the words of Jesus, because Christians, of course, are people who follow Jesus, and this is what Jesus had to say about child suffering. This is a reasonably long passage, but I hope you'll bear with me, because I think it's relevant and the context is important. So this is from Matthew's Gospel in chapter 18. It says this: "At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked him, 'Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?' He called a little child and had him stand among them. And he said, 'I tell you the truth. Unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes a little child like this in my name welcomes me. But,' he says, 'if anyone causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him,' or stumble, it says in another translation, 'it would be better for him to have a large millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea.' Woe to the world because of the things that cause people to sin. Such things must come, but woe to the man through whom they come. If your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life maimed or crippled than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and be thrown into eternal fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into the fire of hell. See that you do not look down on one of these little ones, for I tell you that their angels in heaven always see the face of my Father in heaven. What do you think? If a man owns 100 sheep and one of them wanders away, will he not leave the 99 on the hills and go to look for the one that wandered off? And if he finds it, I tell you the truth, he is happier about that one sheep than about the 99 that did not wander off. In the same way, your Father in heaven is not willing that any of these little ones should be lost." Now, these are strong words of Jesus, and they're quite difficult words for those who don't want to accommodate any kind of theology of a God of wrath or a God of judgment. However we interpret these words about hellfire, for example, these are clearly strong words of judgment on those who cause little ones to stumble. And it's reminiscent also of the Old Testament, where some of the severest judgments in the Old Testament on the kings of Israel and on the nation of Israel are consequences of extreme child abuse, child sacrifice to the god Moloch is a cause of judgment by God. So the first thing I'd want to say about why does God allow the suffering of children is that he doesn't allow it. The first thing I want to say about the suffering of children is that God forbids the suffering, the cruelty to children, and that there is a judgment day coming. So the tears of these tiny creatures, to respond to Dostoevsky, the tears of these tiny creatures will not be unavenged, according to Jesus. God has not constructed the universe in such a way that these tears will be unavenged. Now, this is not to deny that there is forgiveness for the perpetrators of this crime or any crime, but we must first acknowledge that for the word forgiveness to make any sense, there has to first be a condemnation of the sin which is being forgiven. In order for a sinner to be forgiven, the sin must be acknowledged and condemned, as it was in the Truth and Reconciliation Committees of Desmond Tutu in South Africa. Amnesty could never be granted unless the perpetrators of those crimes of apartheid during the apartheid regime, unless those crimes were acknowledged, there could be no amnesty and there could be no reconciliation. So the second point I'd like to make in response to this question, why does God allow the suffering of children is that evil can only be condemned as evil if we have a standard of goodness or a standard of justice by which we can measure it. And the problem, if atheism is true, if God does not exist, the problem is that there is no objective standard of goodness. Everything is socially constructed. I was reading this week in the I magazine, which is the independent newspaper's tabloid edition, here on August the 2nd, which was on Friday, Mary Dejevsky, writing on this case of Daniel Pelka, points out a common factor in some of the recent high-profile abuse cases which have been prosecuted in the courts. One common factor recently has been the malevolent presence of a lover, a live-in boyfriend in a household, a violent live-in boyfriend in a household. And she doesn't appeal to the Bible, but she does appeal to some kind of law of nature. She cites a scientific study, a recent American study, which says that evolution favors monogamy. And this is her quote. She says that monogamy has evolved in some mammals, quote, as a way of keeping their progeny safe from malevolent male rivals. And she says that this is something that people ought to take into account. Now, the problem is that nature is not a sufficient ethic, or you cannot derive a sufficient ethic from nature, because, of course, the same nature that promotes monogamy also promotes polygamy. The same nature also promotes murder, promotes incest, promotes child abuse, promotes rape. Tennyson wrote in his famous poem, Nature Red in Tooth and Claw, how can we derive an ethic from nature by itself? There has to be something that transcends nature, a moral law that transcends nature, a standard of right and wrong by which we can say this is really right and this is really wrong. And the Christian worldview gives you a basis for saying that child abuse is really wrong, and it's not just a social construct. There is an objective basis for it. Now, we should know that even in this country, some forms of child abuse have not always been illegal. And this is something that might be worthy of note in the face of those who accuse the church of promoting child abuse. Before 1885, the age of consent in this country was 12 years old. It rose to 13 years of age in the 1860s. But the Salvation Army and a journalist called W.T. Stead were responsible for raising the age of consent in this country. We have them to thank for it. Stead was the first of the investigative journalists. He actually died, one of the people who died on the Titanic in 1912, sadly. But before that, he exposed the extent of child prostitution that was going on, even at the highest levels of government, of the establishment. People were buying girls as young as 12 years old. It was an absolute scandal. And he proved this was going on through investigative journalism. And he wrote a series of articles called The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon, an absolutely sensational piece of investigative journalism. Stead wrote in that article, if the daughters of the people must be served up as dainty morsels to the passions of the rich, let them at least attain an age when they can understand the nature of the sacrifice which they are asked to make. And people were gripped by these stories. The print run ran out. They had to get more newspapers. And on the back of this, people were horrified. And the Salvation Army put together a petition of over 100,000 signatures that they delivered on the back of a horse and carriage to 10 Downing Street. And they raised the age of consent from 13 to 16 in 1885. The law was changed. So we have the Christian campaigners to thank for that, the state of affairs we have today. But you might say, if God forbids child cruelty, then how come it still happens? Where is God when it goes on, when cruelty goes on to children? Where is God? And this is a very good question. Again, the words of Jesus are enlightening. Matthew 10, verse 29 says, Not one sparrow will fall to the ground outside your Father's care. Not one sparrow will fall to the ground outside your Father's care. Now, some translations have erroneously put in the word apart from your Father's will. But the word will is not in the Greek text. In fact, Jesus says explicitly in Matthew 18, the passage we've just read, verse 14, it is not the will of your Father which is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. It's not the will of the Father that one of these little ones should perish. And not one, even the bird, not even one sparrow falls to the ground without the Father caring about it. Not without him willing it, but without him caring about it. Now, there's an atheist meme which is doing the rounds at the moment on Facebook, which accuses God of callous indifference or voyeuristic complicity in the cases of child rape. Quite a nasty meme that's going around the Facebook at the moment. But I want you to notice here that Jesus said in his teaching about the Last Judgment, and this is actually in Matthew 25, Jesus said, whatever you did to one of the least of these, you did to me. And whatever you didn't do to one of the least of these, you did not do to me. So in other words, when anyone abuses a child, when anyone abuses a child, they abuse Christ. When anyone rapes a child, they rape Christ. When anyone murders a child, they murder Christ. So God, where is God in these situations? He's not voyeuristically watching. He is the victim. He identifies with the victim completely. As Saul, who was a one-time murderer and persecutor of the church, when he was arrested by Jesus on the road to Damascus, Jesus says to him, why are you persecuting me? Why are you persecuting me? Because Jesus identified with the suffering people who Saul was rounding up and killing. So Jesus identified with the victim, as he also did, of course, supremely on the cross. Isaiah 63 verse 9 tells us, in all their affliction, he was afflicted. He was afflicted, the suffering God. There's a story, people always bring up the Holocaust as one of the worst examples, if not the worst example, of the problem of evil in history. And one of the survivors of the Holocaust, a man called Eli Wiesel, recounts his own experience in Auschwitz. He says that one day he was in the concentration camp and he saw a young teenager being hanged by the Nazis. And this teenager took a long time to die. And one of the people witnessing this crime cried out, where is God? Where is God? But Eli Wiesel said he thought he heard another voice that said, there he is on the gallows. There he is on the gallows. Now, this could be taken in two ways. It could be taken in the way of Nietzsche, who said God is dead. Or it could be taken that God suffers with us, that God was suffering there on the gallows with the victim. And this was the position that Dietrich Bonhoeffer took. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was part of the German resistance against Hitler, part of the plot to kill Hitler, in fact, after much soul-searching. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, "Only a suffering God can help us now. Only a suffering God can help us now." But you might come back at this and say, what use is a suffering God? Okay, it might be nice that he's suffering, but what use is that if he doesn't have any power to change things? If he doesn't have any power to stop the suffering? As the philosopher John Waters says on an interview on Socratic ideas, he has a series of interviews on some DVDs called Socratic Ideas. He says, if I go to a dentist with toothache, I don't want to know that the dentist also has toothache. I want the dentist to deal with the toothache. I want him to stop the toothache. So my fourth point in response to that question is that as well as being the victim, Jesus is also the victor. The victor. Jesus has the victory. And here's where I want to turn the problem of evil on its head. The problem of evil, as it's traditionally put by people like David Hume and Epicurus, is that if God is all-powerful, he can stop evil. If he's all loving or all good, he would want to stop suffering and evil, but it still exists. Therefore, God does not exist. But we can turn this on its head. The problem of evil can be read as a promise of victory. We can turn the problem of evil into a promise of victory. How do we do that? We can say that since God is all loving, he wants to stop suffering, and since he is all powerful, he will. He will. We have an absolute guarantee in the character of God that evil will be defeated. And of course, on atheism, there's no such guarantee. There is no basis of hope whatsoever. I'd like to refer to a book by Marilyn McCord Adams. She wrote a book in 2000 called Horrendous Evils and the Goodness of God. And there's actually, if you don't want to read the whole book, there's a good interview about this on philosophybites.com where she talks about this book. And she argues that in those cases where the very meaning of life is challenged by extreme suffering, there's really no rational basis for optimism if there's no God. If there's no truth in the claim that God exists, then there's really no truth whatsoever in optimism. There's no basis for believing that things will get better. Life, as the existentialist philosophers Sartre and Camus argued long ago, life is absurd if there's no God. Atheism leads to materialism, which leads to nihilism, which is hopeless. But the Christian gospel, by contrast, gives us a unique basis for hope because of the historical fact of the bodily resurrection of Jesus in space and time, by which we have a basis for believing that the whole creation will be delivered from its bondage to futility and pain. Perhaps a little pointer to this truth of resurrection could be seen in our experience of remembering things. Some phenomenologists have spoken about this, like the phenomenologist Louis Chrétien. On some theories of memory, everything we've ever experienced is there in our memory somewhere, and it can be recalled. And at some point, of course, we can't remember everything all the time, but it's there stored away like data on a memory stick, and we can suddenly, unexpectedly remember something, and the past is brought back into the present. And this being the case, this is a little pointer to the truth that one day nothing will be lost. Everything that we've lost can be recovered. Just as King David in the Old Testament, on one occasion we read a place called Ziklag. King David had his wives and his children kidnapped. He was at the lowest point of despair. He'd strengthened himself in God, and then he decided to attack the enemy. And we read in 1 Samuel 30 that David recovered everything that he had lost. And Jesus, who is the greatest son of David, declares in John 17, of all that you have given me, I have lost nothing. I have lost nothing. Praise God. Everything that's been lost can be recovered. Another promise in Romans 8:18, Paul says, our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. So in other words, the future's supreme happiness and love that we can experience will infinitely compensate and outweigh all present finite suffering, no matter how horrendous. It will be compensated for, and it will be transformed. Jesus specifically applies this to little ones in Matthew 18, where we read there, in heaven their angels do always behold the face of my Father which is in heaven. So the unavenged tears of suffering children will be avenged according to Jesus, and they will be compensated for, and they will be transformed, just as his own nail-pierced hands, according to Revelation, will be visible in heaven, but they're in beauty glorified. They will be transformed. I want to recommend Keith Ward's book, Why There Is Almost Certainly a God. Good title, in response to Richard Dawkins' New Atheism. Keith Ward writes on page 95, God could give the sufferer new kinds of good in an afterlife, which would have their precise nature only because of the suffering endured. This does not make evil all right, but it does transform it into a wider reality. So I hope those thoughts might be helpful. They're not the total answer, but I hope they might be part of an answer to why God allows suffering. And I would like you to urge you today to put your trust in Jesus Christ. He is both the victim and the victor, and he is the only hope of the world. Jesus promises, he who comes to me, I will by no means cast out. Thank you for listening, and I'll just see if we may have some time for a few comments or questions from the live audience. There were no comments or questions from the live audience, so that means it will be a shorter talk today, which is good actually, because it means more people are likely to have patience to listen to the whole thing. So this has been Good Reasons to Believe. Thank you for tuning in, And do please join us again on a future week. Thank you.